have Twitter. Some of you might. Please tag at Python SE when you tweet and follow Python SE. And oh, hello. So follow us and tweet us, and especially, are you ready? Right now, give a super warm welcome to our savior, Armin. You want this? Do you want a...
Yeah, that would be cool. No, I'm good, thanks. Hey. Good morning. Hold on a second. Good morning. So I have to start this whole thing with sort of a disclaimer, which is that was not actually a presentation I was supposed to be giving tomorrow. So there's my slot tomorrow for the keynote, and I wanted to give a presentation tomorrow. But I'm very good at procrastinating, and so I didn't actually do any slides. So when someone couldn't do the slot today, I actually uncovered an old presentation I never gave, and I did some last-minute changes. I hope it kind of works. But since this is already sort of an impromptu thing, I would really welcome if people just ask questions in between so that this goes over a little bit better. So who am I? My name is Armin Ronacher. I'm doing a lot of open source development in Python. In particular, the Flask framework and a bunch of other sort of projects that sit around with it, which I just recently sort of bundled together into some sort of virtual organization called Pellets. And then I also have another project called Lector, which is sort of a static file content management system. And on a daily basis, I now work with the people at Sentry, which is sort of a error tracking, crash handling software, which I don't know if you're using it. But it also started out as an open source project. So pretty much everything in there is open source or heavily related to open source. So this is sort of a presentation about how you can do open source and not get a very sad person in the process. And as mentioned before, please interrupt me if there are questions or anything else of that sort. Okay, so I want to start this whole thing with sort of a little pre-story of how I ended up doing open source development, because I think that in itself is actually quite interesting. Many years ago, I bought a book called Python for Kids, which was written by, so that is 2002 or 3. So that is a long time ago. And there was a German book series called Programming Language for Children, basically. And they had a bunch of different ones, and I bought this one called Python for Kids. But I didn't actually do that much with it in the beginning because I didn't know how to do programming. But I knew that I wanted to sort of do something with computers. And there was a German Python forum, which I don't know if it still exists, but through that I found a guy who recommended if you want to do Python programming, you really shouldn't use Windows, so you should use Linux. And then this guy over there recommended Ubuntu, which just came out, I think, in early 2004. And sort of that is sort of the end of Python for me for a long period of time, because when Ubuntu was released, I found it interesting, and there was sort of a new sort of community developing around this open source project. And it was the first time I could actually use Linux on my desktop. So I liked the idea, theoretically, to have this open source operating system, but I only tried it once with SUSE Linux, and I didn't manage to install it. But this one actually worked, and that sort of was my introduction to sort of how open source works as not just a user, but sort of also the community behind it. Because the guy who ran the German Ubuntu forums, he had a like, PHP BB installation on there, and I asked him if I can make it look a little bit nicer. And that's sort of how I started working together with other people to just make this online forum look a little bit nicer. And that started the Ubuntu Users DE, which was sort of the largest Ubuntu website at that point. And the interesting thing is that Ubuntu became much bigger than anyone expected in the beginning. And as a result of that, it was possible to sort of easily contribute into this when you were like an early person in the community without having to sort of feel like you don't deserve to be there, which I think in many other projects is sort of the problem that you have. When you, for instance, take the Linux kernel or the Postgres server, if you would want to bring your own patch into it, it feels like a very big challenge because it's such an established project, it's such a huge code base, it's very hard to do anything there. With Ubuntu, it was different because you could just contribute wallpapers, you could do translations. It was very easy to just do something, and the communities themselves were also sort of organized as little open source-ish communities, so it was very easy to just get into this. And then it just became way bigger. We founded the German Ubuntu Association, and then that was sort of my first experience with having the problem that the website had more users than you could put on a single box. That was something that I didn't know was a thing. And then in the process of all of this, the politics started. And it was just interesting to see how, as projects become bigger, it is harder and harder to just focus on technical aspects or just, I don't know, just the fun of it. All of a sudden, there are discussions about who is going to pay for it. If we're going to cooperate with those people, do we have to show the sponsors logo? Are the sponsors okay for what they're doing? That sort of stuff. And then obviously internal power struggles are always a thing, particularly in open source communities where you have forums or mailing lists or something of that sort, because eventually there will be the people with moderator rights and they never agree on what is acceptable and not acceptable policy, especially in Germany, I would say. Because in Germany, I found this surprising. So I'm not from Germany, I'm from Austria, but we sort of speak the same language. I didn't really understand how much Germans like to censor other people online. I find this interesting. And I'm still sort of on the side of just let people write whatever they want to write, even if it's slightly harmful, because I don't know, that's sort of how I was raised, but that was very different on that website, and I think that's still something that German online communities have, is a very strong form of moderation. And when you fall into this environment, there is lots of politics, and that gets you a very quick introduction in how to deal with people. But why did any of this happen? Why was I interested in programming? And the answer for this is that I come from a very, very, very tiny town. And I think the number of 1,500 people is exaggeration. It's probably with the suburbs around it. And the problem is when you live in such a tiny town and you have an interest in something, there's a very good chance you're the only one who has this interest in this area. And this is great about the internet because you can immediately sort of harness all the knowledge around you, even though physically there is no knowledge around you in that field of what you want to do. And then with this open source project, Ubuntu users, which was basically a PHPB forum, which we just to try to improve and do things on, we had like lots of PHP code there. It was a PHPB installation. It was a Docker wiki, which was PHP at the time. We had this. We worked together with the French Ubuntu community, and they had this Planet software, which was also written in PHP, and which was also written in French, which was interesting. So we started using that, and that's when I learned that you can actually have French, not just French comments, because you also have French identifiers in PHP. So that was interesting. And so we had this sort of PHP thing going around, and a friend of mine mentioned that I met online at this point, mentioned that we should really try Moin Moin Wiki, which was a German wiki engine written in Python, and that sort of was the introduction in how I actually started programming in Python. Because even though I bought a book on Python before, I didn't really know what to do there. And it was much easier at the time to program in PHP, because you just write something in a file, you don't have to do anything, you just load it in the browser and you get the syntax errors there, and you get sort of an immediate result. And also this whole idea of you write programming code locally and then deploy it on the server, that didn't really exist in my mind. So we all had, we literally SSH'd onto the server and edited files on there. It was kind of funny. But it worked for a really small project at the time. So anyways, the sort of the proper diving into programming was through the Moin Moin wiki engine. And then I sort of realized only afterwards that the only reason I managed to program in any reasonable form or shape was because there were other people who helped me. And this is very nice in an online community, because you can start to pretend to be a person that you really aren't, and nobody's going to dislike you for this. So basically, in an IRC channel, I think most people start to eventually pretend that they can solve problems for other people. And if they can't, they will Google it in the background. And that's a very good way to learn. So that's kind of how I started doing this. There was an IRC channel that we worked in together, Georg and me. Georg was he was a core developer at Python. I don't know if he was at the time or if he became afterwards, but he sort of helped me a little bit getting some things going. And in this IRC channel, we just started helping other people as well. And even if they had a problem that I couldn't solve, I would just pretend I know how to solve it and then just Google in the background and try to sort of cheat myself into this conversation. And it's a very, very good way to sort of expand your knowledge in a certain area, I guess, because your own problems are never quite as interesting as other people's problems. So that's sort of how that happened. And then, because we had this idea, we wanted to replace all of the PHP code on Ubuntu users eventually with Python code. There was all this stuff in PHP which just didn't exist in Python. And that's sort of how all of this started, that I actually did open source software for other people. Because I think about a year after we decided to do things, it was 2005, something like that, and we wanted to do more Python code. And there was, Django just came out. Or it was just announced. I don't know, remember how exactly it went. I think they went to PyCon and said, we have made this awesome framework, but they didn't actually release any code. So it was sort of closed source, open source project at the point. But I was already interested in sort of what they were doing, and there was I think there was a talk that you could watch. And then eventually they released Django as a framework, and it was this huge thing. And I only wanted small parts of it because I already wrote my own tools in the absence of the existence of Django. And so the one thing I wanted was the template engine, because before that, I literally concatenated strings in Python files, and that wasn't very cool. So I just ripped out the Django template engine and then copy-pasted code and tried to improve it. And then there was this guy who helped me actually write a slightly improved parser, because the one in Django didn't actually do what I wanted to do. And it was really horrible, the first thing that came out. But it didn't stop me from putting it on the internet. And that's immediately when I learned that just because something is on PyPI, or at that point it was just my own server, it doesn't actually mean that you can do that. So the immediate first response was Jacob Kaplan-Moss wrote me an email that I didn't put any copyright information in there. Because there was just so much code copy-pasted out of Django, and I had to learn about how licenses work. And that also gets you really quickly started on the sort of the culture that goes with open source projects, more than just the politics around it. So the first time I actually met Jacob Kaplan-Moss was a couple of years later at the conference, and he was a different person than I remembered from the conversation I had on IRC and email. Because on textual conversation, it's very hard to judge people's emotions, or you can assume that there are emotions when they're none, or the other way around. And then also when you talk with people from other cultures, or in that case, other languages, it gets really, there can be a lot of misunderstandings. And my personal takeaway back from that conversation about the license was that, why do you even make such a big deal out of the license? Why, like, who cares? Like, it's open source. Clearly, there is not, like, I already understood at that point that BSD doesn't really mean that there are any rules attached. It's just, don't advertise with my name. There is no warranty on it, and just don't remove the copyright. So I removed the copyright, but really, I didn't quite understand what the important part of it was. And it wasn't really an intentional thing. But in any case, through this sort of experience with, I did something wrong on licensing, I sort of looked into licensing, and I discovered how absolutely horrible and terrible everything with licensing is. And that's sort of like, if you can ignore everything else from the presentation, I think this is a really important one, because licensing is just, because I had an early exposure to just doing licensing wrong, even if just on a very, very small scale, which was not to include the copyright thing, I had an interest in how it works. And it is just very confusing in many different ways. And if you do it wrong, you can inadvertently hurt yourself, because as an open source project, you accept contributions from other people. And they come from different countries, different cultures, and they come from different legal systems. And then in the end, you have this mishmash of code from people from all over the world, and they sort of contributed under the understanding that they contribute under the license of the project. And even that, I think, from a legal point of view, is kind of not really all that clear. So we sort of, together, all the open source community on small projects has set up this legal gray area about how licensing works, where we just pretend that any of the contributions go in under the license of the project unless there's some other shenanigans set up. And I had a project which was GPL licensed, and then I learned from a friend that that was a bad idea. And then he couldn't use it. And that was the thing, I wanted someone to use this. And I was like, why can you not use it? I said, like, I can't use this GPL code in this application because for this and this reason. And that's sort of how I learned that I wanted him to use it because he works at a company there, and I found it interesting that someone would build a commercial project on an open source project. And he couldn't do it. And I tried to convince him that my understanding of the GPL is that he can use it. And that didn't go very far. And then I wanted to relicense it. And then there was this other guy who also already contributed code on it. And he said, I have to rip out all of his code because he will never contribute to something that's not GPL. And that was really frustrating because you have something there where you spend a lot of time in making it work. And then there's this one person who can't use it. Yeah, that was very frustrating. And there will be another part about licensing in this presentation because I think it's an important topic. But the problem is you can as an open source project, you can really run into the direction where you want people to use it and then they don't. And then you try to figure out how can you make that. And a big reason of why they don't do it is because of stupid politics, basically. Yeah, so my goals for open source was basically, that slide is not supposed to be here, I think. Yeah, let's just pretend it doesn't exist. So why did I do open source? I think, to be honest, I don't quite know because it just sort of went into the open source community. But I think now that, would I do it again? Yeah, because it's fun, rewarding, and it's sort of the best way to find friends if you're sort of not the most communicative person. And it's a very nice way to find common ground on something where, like from a purely statistical point of view, I think it's much easier to find people that agree with you on the internet than physically, because like the Tinder thing, like where you swipe through people, that's kind of how open source works in a way, because you just stop interacting with people that you don't want to interact with. So it builds up this community of people that think exactly the same, which I think is probably a net negative in many ways, but it's a very good way to accelerate sort of learning experience because there's fewer disagreements. The downside of this is that obviously once you have this community of people that think alike, critical thinking sort of degrades and becomes non-existing. But up to a certain point, it's really nice to have people that think exactly like you. And then the nice thing is that you can learn about it, and mostly by failing and then talking to others. And you learn new cultures, new languages. For me, and then also for Georg, it was sort of our first real good opportunity to travel to other countries because people were interested in what we were doing, and conferences was a really good way to show this to others. And that wouldn't have worked if it was not an open source project. And yeah, in many ways, it absolutely paid off because you learn new things, you get introduced to many more interesting people. And the other thing is that if you do something that people think there's a value in it, it puts yourself into a position where you don't feel quite as awkward to talk to a person that you're really interested in talking to, because you feel like you might have achieved something, at least to some degree, that you're sort of you're allowed to talk to a person that you look up to, which is much harder if that person doesn't even know what you're doing and why you would want to talk to that person. In many ways, it's wrong anyways, because most people are absolutely happy to just have any random conversation at all, but sort of a conversation starter, I guess. And for me, just seeing other people use my software is just a very good feeling, and that's why I do this more than anything else, I think. But I would say my experience with open source sort of is many years before GitHub happened, and it was much different than what sort of open source is now, because it has sort of been formed into a social network almost. And I find it much harder now to stay motivated in using something because there is so stay motivated in doing open source, because there's so much more pressure on people. When I started doing open source, it was just any person who started using it, I was happy about. Now I feel very different about it, because all of a sudden there are commercial companies, and there's nothing, I have no problem at all with companies using my things, and I like doing that. But with that, there comes the sort of entitlement of people within organizations. Because initially, when commercial companies started using my software, it was like 5 people working for a gaming startup or something like this. And there were people who intentionally chose the software because they wanted to use it, and it was a friendly environment to work in. There were people who wanted to use my software, and it was nice. But now it's, for instance, take a big company with 500 employees. There were maybe 3 people who chose the technology, everybody else has to use it. And they come to your bug tracker and complain when it doesn't work. And that's sort of not the nice experience. And in that situation, it can become very hard to stay motivated. The best way to stay motivated in doing open source development is just to use your own things. If I didn't learn it long enough, but it's very easy to stop using your own software, lose motivation in working on it, and then there's this GitHub issue tracker, which sort of spirals out of control because everybody else is still using it, and they all of a sudden want things that you never anticipated. Would be something that is worth putting into software, or just weirdest corner cases they run into, you name it. And it took me a very long time to sort of get over this idea that I can give a project to someone else. In fact, that might only have happened 2 years ago. And that is a problem, I think, from a psychological point of view, because it's when you do open source for a longer period of time, it's very easy to accumulate more open source projects. And in Python, that was never as extreme as I guess it is in JavaScript, because in JavaScript, people make tiny, tiny modules. And I know people that have like 500 projects on GitHub, and I don't quite understand how they stay sane. For me, it was already hard with 15 projects, because like, as you have more users, they all have their own problems. You have more and more notifications coming in, and when it hits like a certain number, you just stop looking at it and just look away. And that is a huge sort of emotional problem, and I just started mark all as red, basically. And that doesn't help either. And thankfully, you can unsubscribe from GitHub notifications now. But for a long period of time, it was not even that control, so I literally just marked them as not as red. So that's one way to stay motivated, is basically only develop the things that you actually use yourself, and then give the rest to other people, or at least write in there that you don't maintain it. And then the other thing is just be way more boring in the things you do, because as you put more features into it, more people will want to shape it in the direction. And at one point, it's just much better you just say, stop, we're not going to accept any of this stuff, because it sets sort of expectations. And one thing that it took me way too long to realize is that just because other people build something around you that looks conceptually cooler, it doesn't mean that you have to abandon the things that you do. It's very easy to see what other people are doing and then try to force your project into supporting like that thing, like be it asynchronous HTTP or I/O handling, or whatever it is. Like when Node.js came out as this technology stack that everybody found interesting, I really wanted to sort of retain people in the Python community that would otherwise go to Node. And I looked into various different things and how to make sort of my own stuff work more like Node.js. And then I realized that actually there will still be people using your stuff even though Node.js is existing. And then you don't have to compromise the ideas that went into your own project for this. So yeah, I try not to overstep the original goals of the projects anymore. Licensing, again, I want to just quickly go over this because this is such a big topic. In the Python community over the last couple of years, we sort of have agreed on BSD and MIT being a really good sort of starting point for licensing. And largely also because nothing else, so GPL is a complicated topic, but at least commercial modules for Python largely don't exist. There are some, but they're very, very rare, and they usually come coupled with something else. So if the ground expectation for Python programmers is that something that you use is BSD, MIT, Apache licensed, and that sort of kind of works together and it can ignore licensing for the most part. Also, a lot of the development happens on the servers, so you can kind of ignore licenses anyways to a large degree. But the problem that you run into is that there will be other people that have other code, particularly GPL, and then it becomes very quickly a political topic, and then often people don't understand why GPL doesn't work for them. And then changing it afterwards is really, really hard. And a lot of projects start going down GPL because they really want contributors to contribute to the same sort of idea that went into the project. But realistically speaking, and I think that might be a little bit controversial, but realistically speaking, nobody enforces GPL. Because the only way to enforce a license is to go to a lawyer and say, that guy did something bad with my project, and he's violating the license. And if you actually look into it, most GPL cases are for very big corporations, or if they're not for very big corporations, then they are for individual developers who went to like a free software foundation or something else to get a lot of money to get then into a court fight with a big corporation. And if you're willing to sort of defend your GPL license to that degree, then go for it. If you're not willing to do that, you're just making it harder for everybody else. Because if you're not enforcing your GPL license, it's basically just implicitly BSD. It's obviously completely the wrong way to look at it from a legal point of view, but practically speaking, everybody violates GPL left and right every single day, and nothing happens. Which also is not good for the GPL, because it means that it sets sort of this precedent that you can ignore the GPL, which is totally against what the license should be. And very often you see this, that there are projects, like just go to a popular GPL licensed Python project, go to the issue tracker, and there will be someone asking that to relicense under BSD. And then when the pressure gets big enough, then someone will look into and ask all the contributors if they can relicense it, and then that takes 2 years, 3 years, sometimes it never happens. I know that on the last company I worked for, I really wanted to use, what was it called? Dulwich, which was a Git client written in Python. It was GPL licensed, and in the form that we wanted to use it, we couldn't use it. And I just made an issue track like, would you be willing to relicense it under BSD? Because we can't use it, we just shell out right now to the Git client, which doesn't seem very useful. So I still have the notifications open on that issue, and like they are currently in the process of relicensing for I think 2 years, 2.5 years, and it's just a painful experience for them because they have to get all the contributors, and then even that from legal point of view, it's not even quite clear if that's the right way to do it. But in that case, at least they achieved it. There's another project called Xapian, and Xapian is an open source project which is a search engine like Lucene or many other these search indexes. But the big difference is that that was written by people as an open source project within a company, and they GPL licensed it. And then it happened what happens to many companies. That company got acquired, that company got acquired again, and now all of the rights and copyrights are sitting at a French holding company somewhere who has zero interest in relicensing this. So they have this huge ongoing attempt to rewrite as much as possible from the software, which is still GPL licensed, so that they can then basically do any form of commercial work on top of this, because there are too many companies who will not touch GPL software, which is a problem. So you can always relicense GPL under something else if you control it yourself, the copyright. But if you ever lose control of your copyright, then you lose that opportunity. And there's many people that got burnt in this process. Another popular one is the MySQL project. The MySQL project basically spinned off into many other companies. One of them was, I think, is MariaDB. And they discovered that the bindings for MySQL are GPL licensed. So for the server, it wasn't a problem, but the bindings were GPL licensed. And the only people that actually held the copyright to do commercial releases of this was the old MySQL AB. And so the new people who were part of the original developers didn't have the opportunity to commercialize it. So what they did is they went back like 10 years or so. They looked at the oldest source release of the MySQL driver, which was still BSD. And then they started the work of 10-year-old code because they couldn't use their own software anymore from a newer one. Yes? to go GPL?
Yes.
Yeah,
It was a deliberate move to block out other people from using the project.
yeah. The remark was that it was a deliberate thing to do GPL to block out people. That I subscribe in many ways, especially because there was a PHP exemption in there. But they got burnt in the end afterwards, anyways. So might be self-inflicted damage, but it's damage anyways. And sort of, I know that a lot of people are really, really subscribing to the idea of GPL, and this is absolutely correct. It's not the wrong way to look at the license, but you at least should know why you're doing it. And this is a quote from Steve Streeting. He wrote the Ogre engine, and he afterwards did Source Tree for Atlassian. And he had a LGPL licensed, I think. Yeah, it was an LGPL licensed engine, and that was sort of always the way they did it. And they did it because they wanted contributions, and they want contributions on the same rules. And then it turned out that the ecosystem around them changed, and then it was impossible to use LGPL licensed code in certain deployment scenarios like game consoles and the App Store. And then they relicensed to MIT. And sort of that was part of the quote that was in his blog post about the most useful contributions didn't come because the license forced them to give them the contributions, but because people were motivated to actually contributing it. And those are the people that will contribute regardless of the license of the project. So I'm basically running out of time. I just want to very quickly go about this part, which is kind of sort of a hot topic. Like, how do you actually make money out of open source? For Flask, the simple answer is you can't really, at least not for the project itself. There is no reasonable way to make money off a library. The only way to do that is to sell consulting, which is sort of a non-scalable business model because you're kind of the only person that does it. That is a functioning business model, but it doesn't scale up. But it's a very good way to meet more people, to get introduced to companies that you want to work for. It's a very good way to sort of start a career. And I think I have friends who sort of did the same thing with open source libraries, where they just started building it while they were studying on the side, and then afterwards they ended up with something that was valuable, that the company would take ownership of the open source project and pay them a good salary. So that's definitely one way they can do that. But the other one is Sentry, which is an application. And I don't know, does anyone here use Sentry? It's a Python error crash handler software. Yeah, quite a few. So the nice thing about Sentry is that it was literally an open source project started within a company, and it's still an open source project. There's like that you can just download it, you can run it yourself. But one thing that happened, which I think nobody really quite expected, is that all the companies that were looking for a solution like this just started using this open source project in like their own installations. And all of a sudden there were like everywhere in the world there were little Sentry installations. And the original creator of the project, his name is David Kramer, he came out from the Django community. He just started to host it on his own server. Like he wrote it and then he decided that he's going to host it on his own server and make a software as a service business out of it. And just like was looking at, does it make sense? Can it work? And then people started to put their credit card in. And the interesting thing about this is that it's 100% open source. Like there's no shenanigans going on. Like you have to pay money to get a certain feature. But people like not have to maintain software, so they just pay some money to get it hosted. But because all of these big companies already started using it before, there's all of a sudden this sort of penetration into the ecosystem where everyone already has some exposure to Sentry. So if they switch between jobs, they will say, I want this software as well, but I don't want to have to maintain it myself anymore. Can we just pay you money? And that is something that I never really expected, that is a side effect of doing open source development, because your potential customer base is quite big for any software project. But if you target developers in particular, they will move between companies and they want to retain the same technology as they had before. And then once they leave a tiny company and they go to a bigger one, they would just go to like the manager and say, can we just pay money to have not to deal with running it ourselves? And that's definitely a way you can monetize open source projects that are not libraries, but they're applications. Yeah, and so now it's a functioning business with 15 employees, fully bootstrapped, and it's making money. And that just came out of the open source community as a side project between work. All right, yeah, and that's sort of my impromptu in-between presentation. If you have any questions, just shoot, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Armin. For question, please, we have two microphones, one in this side and one the other side. If you have any question, please use the microphones since we are recording and everyone can understand the question. Thank you. Any questions?
There's one here.
Okay, thank you very much for an inspiring talk. Regarding the background of programmers, open source developers, there's a software engineering track, which is the educational part of becoming a programmer, and then there's the other part, which is more playful, more fun, driven by pure interest. Do you have any comment on how they interplay or the difference between sort of traditional software engineering and the open source, more playful community?
It probably depends on where, so what culture those people are educated in. So I would personally, like, I grew up in Austria, and for me, the Austrian education system is absolutely horrible. And in particular for universities, because sort of our governmental background wants this idea that everybody should have equal chance to go to university. And while there are many ways to achieve that, they chose the worst, which is literally you can just go to university and no qualifications required, other than you have to pass like a test which is in your previous educational background. So if you, for instance, basically finish high school, there's an Austrian equivalent of an LSAT, and then if you get a reasonable mark on it, you can go to university. And so I had a lot of, so I did the same thing. I went to university there, and but I didn't finish it because I got so frustrated by sort of the culture at that university, because it didn't really, like, there were so many people that just went there because sort of the expectation was that you go to university and do software development, that there were just so many people I didn't want to interact with. And the Austrian problem out of this is that not just are there a lot of people who end up studying software development who don't have a real passion for doing it, which is, you don't have to have a passion for what you're doing. You can still be a really good, intelligent person and solving a lot of problems in that field. But it's not the people that I wanted to associate myself with too much. And then I dropped out of university, did some other things, and now I see that my colleagues are just finishing university. And I find this now from that perspective kind of weird, because they come out with zero experience in practical things, and they're the same age as me, and they've already been doing this for like almost, I don't know, 12, 13 years. And that is, for me, hard to sort of see as a comparison, because it just feels weird. But the thing is, in the United States, for instance, I mean, in many other countries, there are people coming out of universities who are so much better than what I could ever achieve. And those people are very inspiring, and they have a motivation for doing it. And so I think that my experience with university is sort of the worst way to look at the topic of someone who does software engineering from an educational background. So that's why I'm probably not the best person to ask about this. I think that the people are very different when they sort of do it themselves versus when they come out of a university, which especially when you're a PhD student, because you're going into such a specific field that I don't know how to explain it, but basically, in many ways, you're always trying to, like, independent of education, you're always trying to work with people that do something similar to you, where you can share some passion. And I think it's much easier when you have a broad sort of education. So for me, open source, like, I do it in all kinds of areas. It's Python, web, but it's other programming languages I like to play with as much as I can. So it's very easy for me to find more people to talk to about those topics. For someone who is studying a very specific topic as a PhD student, it's much harder to find people that have sort of the same passion in this field. And because of that, I think it's, if you want to do that, then you you turn, I wouldn't say you turn into a different person, but you sort of will try to find different people to talk to that are usually at universities or that came to large companies like Google out of a university. So you can find people with similar interests there. And so that's just a very different sort of psychological way to do this, I guess. Anyone else?
Hi, I have a question here. You talked about, first of all, thanks for the talk, and you talked about licensing and how horrible it is, which I completely agree with. But, and then you also mentioned that you wanted to use this software and you didn't get the approval to use it during your everyday work and things like that. So my question is that I see that there is this divide between the corporate companies and the open source community. So how do you see it in the future? Do you think these software corporate companies will be more acceptable of the open source products in the future? Because right now it doesn't work that well. It doesn't work that well. So.
Well, so the obvious one is that it's changing a ton right now. I think with regards to licensing, companies are actually much better in general than small open source projects are. And the reason for this is that when you work in a company, there's a clear employment contract set up. So the company retains the entire rights on the software. So they can put a license on if they want. And there are some companies who choose to go open source and some companies that don't. And it's more and more companies that want to have open source be an important part of their business. I mean that a couple of years ago, there was basically, there was Google maybe, and maybe some others. But now it's like Microsoft, the sort of the behemoth of closed source development is doing pretty much all of the things they're doing for developers as an open source project now. Like the entire .NET framework is open source. They started to do a mini version of Visual Studio, which is open source. When they acquired Xamarin, which was sort of the company behind the Mono framework, and the people who started the Mono framework were the people that started, at least some of them, were the people who started the GNOME project, which was sort of the showcase open source project. When they went to make Mono, they commercialized it and sort of ended up in a licensing situation where some people couldn't use it. And then Microsoft came in, purchased all the rights, and actually made it fully open source. So I think that is definitely changing because now you have really big companies who are just seeing that they can't make money by selling a development tool because there's just so much open source stuff in it. By being in it, I mean like in the general environment, that it's a disadvantage for them to try to sell it. So I think we reached a point where development tools, unless they are services, they are actually just by definition to start out with open source as an assumption, and then you have to have a really good reason for not doing it open source. And I find it interesting because that definitely wasn't the case 5-10 years ago.
Especially with the Microsoft.
Yeah.
They have TypeScript as open source as well, I guess.
Yeah.
So.
Maybe there will be, and also they have Ubuntu running on the Windows kernel now. So maybe they will eventually have an open source Windows. So who knows?
We have last question here.
Hey, thanks for an interesting talk. So I wanted to know, like, in your experience, has anything changed from when you started doing open source, say, 10 years back to how it works now? Like, what's your experience working with open source today? And how is it different from when you started?
For me, it's a lot more stressful now. That's partially because my projects are way bigger, but also because it's a lot more people all of a sudden who is using your stuff just because of GitHub. And also, I mentioned before that when you do open source, it's very easy to sort of accumulate people around you who are the same as you. And especially in open source, it's super easy. You eventually end up with 100% male teenagers on a project. And that is an environment which is not necessarily the most friendly, but there's an environment that's very easy sort of as a member of that group to work in. And then as you grow older, you sort of assume that sort of everybody grows older with you around you. So one of the things, my projects never had a code of conduct because they were so old that, like, I remember when Ubuntu had a code of conduct that was in the beginning, there were a bunch of colleagues of mine who didn't even want to sign it because they said that I don't understand why I have to sign a contract for reasonable behavior. And sort of that thinking, that was very prevalent when I started doing open source. And now it swung the complete opposite direction where there is more overhead in managing community than there is actually in programming, which is, but I think that will just change a little bit back. So it will maybe meet in the middle where there will be reasonable discourse where we don't have to spend quite as much time in maintaining the community. But that I see as a problem, especially because once you have sort of exposure to people know who you are, you have to be super careful in what you're saying and how you tread the internets, because there are people who get very emotional about certain topics and then they have a right for doing that. But they will also voice it very clearly in all types of the spectrum. And I never expected open source to be about that, but it is now. And that is something that, at least when I started, I didn't notice it, and I think it changed. The other thing that for me changed is just I like GitHub for the development tool that it is. I absolutely hate GitHub when it ever gets to Hacker News. So I had this thing where people submit a random ticket to Hacker News, and there was like some nasty comment on there. And then all of a sudden you have like people who were not working, who never used the project, who never had anything to do with it, had a conversation in your bug tracker about like who is right, who is wrong, and then thumbs up, or thumbs down, or emoji poo face, whatever, and then image macros appear. And it's just, it's really annoying. So I'm very glad that you can close these issues now so that this conversation doesn't happen. But that I wish would not be a thing, because you can just have the conversation on Hacker News. You don't have to have the conversation in someone else's bug tracker. The fact that this sort of became a social network more than it actually became a solving technical problems thing, that is a development I'm not happy with. And I really wish there was a feature in GitHub where you can say, like, if that person follows the link through Hacker News to a bug tracker, he cannot reply. I would be super happy with that. Or some way to say, like, temporarily lock this issue to only allow people to reply to it who already replied to an issue on the bug tracker 2 days ago. Something like this, because it's just mental when it happens, and there is no value in it. There's zero value in it, especially because there's just so much traffic going on that there might be really good comments in between all of this other crap. So that's a change not happy with. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now it's time for a fika. Coffee is ready, and then we will start at 11 o'clock in respective rooms. Either here or another room which is close to the dining room, or one of the workshop room which is at the end of this corridor.